Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me for one of my regular updates from Washington, D.C. If all things go well, today may be the last day the Senate's in session before the August recess. Looking back over the last couple of months, I think we have put some real points on the board. We've continued from a national standpoint to appoint a number of judges. I think it's up to 150 federal judges have been appointed during the first 2+ years of President Biden's administration. On a Virginia home front, we very, very proud to see the $1.5 billion that has come to Virginia from the infrastructure bill that will go to broadband. That on top of the $700 million that have come from another program I put forward through the Treasury Department and convincing then Governor Northam to put up $500 million from the so-called ARPA bill. We have enough money in the pipeline right now for Virginia that if we don't get 98% coverage over the next 2 to 3 years, it is a failure of execution, not of money. And I can assure you that I'm going to continue to focus on this relentlessly. It is something that goes back even to my days as governor. You shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a world-class job. And post-COVID, we all know that is absolutely critical on broadband. So we've made progress there. We also, I think, had an important event, I think it was last week, where the governor and I laid out how Virginia is going to become more competitive for trying to obtain some of the investments that will be generated out of the CHIPS Act on semiconductors and semiconductor supply chain. We've not done as well as I'd liked in terms of some of the big announcements already. We are in the running on a number of others. But this $52 billion that were in the CHIPS and Science Act, it needs to go not just to large fabrication facilities, it needs to go to a series of entities along the whole supply chain. And Virginia very much is in the game on that. Today, in the Senate, real time, we are working on the Defense Authorization Bill. What's good about this bill is it's not being loaded up with a lot of political baggage the way the bill was loaded up that way in the House, which frankly would undermine it ever getting to the president's desk. 3 things that are, I think, relevant to Virginia and to some of my activities on NDAA. One is there is a 5.2% pay increase for the men and women of our military. That is absolutely critical. Although let me also editorial comment here that if you're getting a promotion, particularly up in the officer ranks, and with that promotion comes an increase in pay, you may not be getting that promotion because currently one senator, the senator from Alabama, is holding up all of the promotions across the board for a completely unrelated political item about whether women in the military ought to get access to reproductive health care. I think it weakens our national defense, and again, hopefully we could resolve some of that today, but the NDAA is up on 5.2% of pay increase. More specifically, I've got my cheat sheets here in case I need to go into details. $625 million in the Defense Authorization Bill for military construction. That $625 million is just for Virginia-based projects, and this is across the Commonwealth, not just in Hampton Roads, but that's terribly important. And on a personal basis, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, we passed out our Intelligence Authorization Bill, which sets the rules and the top-line funding for our 17+ intelligence agencies unanimously. Very proud of that. Traditionally, that bill goes along with the Defense Authorization Bill, and we now have it in what's called the manager's package because virtually everybody has signed off. But getting from here to there and hopefully finishing this bill today is what the Senate is absolutely focused on. 2 or 3 quick other items. I know I'm gone on too long already, but one is the Access Act. We reintroduced this year. This is bipartisan, common sense that says if you get tired of a social media platform, you ought to be able to easily transfer your data to a new platform if you're tired of the old one. I mean, think about this in terms of, I was an old telecom guy, number portability, how hard it used to be if you moved way back in the 90s, if you had to move from one telephone company to another and you had to change your phone number. We had number portability. This is data portability. And the Access Act, as well as saying if you move to a new social media company and you still want to communicate with somebody on the old one, you got to have interoperability as well. This is a common sense item, and we all know we've seen some chaos in some of the social media companies. I'm not sure whether Twitter is now X or whatever else Mr. Musk may want to call it next week, but we've clearly seen a lot of ups and downs in social media. We need more competition. The Access Act is a common sense way to do that. Chesapeake Bay restoration, this is a legislation that Tim and I and our fellow senators from Pennsylvania and Maryland and Senator Manchin from West Virginia, to make sure we put the resources behind one of Virginia and the region's greatest assets. Chesapeake Bay, it's not only great for the outdoors and fishing, but it's an economic engine driver in terms of tourism and a host of other areas. And we need to make sure we do the appropriate funding there. And I also, as I try to look without my glasses, which is a little, I want to. Last item that I wanted to put up, and this is more for, well, it's for Richmond and South Side and Southwest, the Motorsports Fairness Act. This is we have provided certain accelerated depreciation for our racetracks and speedways, not just the big NASCAR tracks, but something like VIR outside of Danville. For years, that kind of accelerated appreciation for that very important industry expires in a couple of years. So Senator Todd Young and I, bipartisan bill to make sure that we keep that provision in place so that fans of NASCAR and fans of motorsports can have world-class facilities here in Virginia and around the country. So I've got a series of other items, but I've gone too far, so why don't I turn it over? I think Laura is going to be handling the questions today, and again, appreciate your tuning in. And I will say this too, while we're getting, as we go into recess, I will be traveling around Virginia during the August recess, and we'll be coming to a very hot and sweaty market near you shortly. So with that, I'll turn it over to the questions.
Senator, our first question will be Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Okay.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thanks for taking questions. I wanted to ask you about a renewed effort to raise the federal minimum wage. I know in the past you've been on board with an effort to raise it to $15. This one is $17, and I know you've also expressed some concern about what that could do to small businesses and that it could move jobs overseas. So wondering what you think of this latest.
Where I am today, if we have not done anything in 3 or 4 years, that might change. And recognizing that currently the minimum wage, federal minimum wage, is $7.25. That's crazy. Obviously, post-COVID, with the tight labor market, wages have moved up. I still think the $15 number is the right one for right now. In Virginia, we are at, there was a phase-in going up, and I can't recall whether we're at $11 or $12 at this point. But I think it's important that we raise the minimum wage. I think $15 sets that balance right now, and candidly, many starting jobs have gotten to the $15 level already. But let's go ahead and see if we can get that on the books, because while Virginia has taken action, there are a host of states that are still at $7.25, and the fact that if you're making $7.25 an hour, you can't put food on their table or a roof over your head, and frankly, those states that are still at $7.25 don't have healthier economies, I think, on virtually any indice. So keep me at 15. We'll again look at economic circumstances down the road. In the meantime, again, in Virginia, we're not even up to 15 yet in terms of the state minimum wage.
Senator, our next question will be Felicity Taylor with CBS 19.
Hi, Senator. Recently, 5th District Congressman Bob Good said we shouldn't be afraid of a government shutdown. If it were to happen, that could slow down the passport offices, which you've been working to fix and speed up. So what are your thoughts on what he said about a potential shutdown, and how would it affect Central Virginia?
Well, for those of us who were in elective office when we've seen government shutdowns in the past, we know how devastating it is. People, you lay off air traffic controllers, the safety of our airspace is in jeopardy. If you end up shutting down our national parks, people's long-term Plans for holidays are shut down, which has an economic ripple effect. You shut down our federal government, and people who are already waiting too long for passports won't get them. And the remarkable thing for some people to make these comments, in the last government shutdown, they passed a law, signed off by everybody, that says if you have a future government shutdown, government employees are still going to get paid. So anyone who says, well, no problem with the government shutdown, you're going to still spend taxpayer money paying government employees. The services aren't going to be available. It's going to be an economic hit, and it shows complete inability to govern. So I think in a state like Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, where we have disproportionate number of federal workers, we've got disproportionate numbers of defense contractors and others who would be affected. I don't know how anyone rationally would say there's no problem with a government shutdown. That is not my view, and frankly, it is not the view of most of the senators I work with, Democrat or Republican.
Senator, we're moving on to Mia Nelson with WSET.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your time today. With Hunter Biden's plea deal now being on hold, what do you think about all of this? And do you think this is going to be something that President Biden is going to have to deal with for his entire campaign?
I don't have the slightest idea. I mean, I do think it's been appropriate that President Biden, my understanding, has stayed away entirely from any of the potential prosecutions of Hunter Biden. I think it's also been appropriate that President Biden stays away from any of the possible prosecutions of Donald Trump. The Justice Department is an independent entity, and nobody is above the law, no matter who they are or where they are or who they're related to or what they've been. But following the ins and outs on particularly Hunter Biden's case, I've not followed it that closely. I got a lot to say grace over. Luckily, trying to micromanage the Justice Department, as the way some of my colleagues are, or undermine the role of the FBI, that's not part of my job.
Senator, moving on to Mike Gooding with 13 News Now. Mike? Okay, we're going to jump to Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I saw on Facebook where you met with a group of interns from Danville's Institute for Advanced Learning and Research whenever they came up to D.C. recently. And in that Facebook post, you said that the future of the South Side looks bright. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little more on the impact that meeting those interns had on you, and what about that experience prompted you to make such an exciting statement?
Well, Amy, thank you. And I mean, usually get the last question, and although there may be a couple of my friends who will come back in because this is such an uplifting last question to leave on, but if somebody else got a question, we have to answer. I've been such an advocate for Southside since I've been governor. I feel like for a long time, and it's not just Southside, same thing is true of Southwest Virginia. Communities that for a long time powered Virginia's economy. Southwest was coal in terms of energy, Southside was tobacco and textiles. They were the economic driving forces of the Commonwealth. Obviously, Southside, tobacco's not as strong, textiles has gone down. It's had some challenging time. The Institute of Advanced Learning in Danville, an entity that I was proud to start when I was governor, that institute partners with Virginia Tech and a series of other educational institutions to say, how do we have the creative process happening in Southside Virginia? I've been to the ILR a number of times. There's got a great new program in terms of training folks for the Navy and the Navy production facilities in Danville. That's a really cool, creative idea. They see these students who came from a variety of schools, not just Virginia schools, but were all Southside natives. The experience they were getting. What ILR offers is a chance to come home and do cutting-edge research if you choose to after college. And I have to be careful I love all parts of Virginia, but I can't think of a community that is kind of more on the rise than Danville at this point. To see the amount of growth that's going on downtown, to see the old mills that have been converted into living space or working space, to see the population growth. For so many of our rural communities, we've seen population declines. The Danville metro market now is actually increasing population. And I've met with not just the kind of interns, but I've met with the kind of young community leaders, business leaders there. They are both diverse, they are active. This is, if I'm a stock investor and I've done pretty well on the business side, I would be long. That means invest in and be a long time hold for Danville and Southside. I think it's coming back, and whatever I can do in this job to help that, count me in.
Senator, our final question will be Joe Thomas.
I was wondering, I was just, I know it's right before the August recess. So, Joe, I want to see if you can ask me as nice and uplifting question as Amy Knowles just did.
Well, it'll depend on your perspective, I guess, Ben. And I'm sure you all had a good laugh at my expense when I wasn't there when you called on me last week. So I'm actually going to harken back to the Freedom to Vote Act. And I did some digging, and it appeared most of the instances where people were not.
All right, Joe, this is not, let's be clear, and I think hope everybody can listen. I'm not trying to not answer the question, but you are breaking up at this point. This sounds like it's too politically convenient if the cell phone coverage is dropping on your question. But can you try it again? Freedom to Vote Act is bad because?
No, I didn't say that. I said I was concerned via the people I spoke to said that their concerns were their votes had not been cast because when they got to vote, there were people who had already voted in their name, and as having a weaker ID system helped that.
Well, Joe, if you've got specific individuals, especially if they're in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that got turned away from voting because somebody come in with a fake ID and voted in their name, one, we've seen virtually no evidence of that, not only in Virginia, but across the country. But if there is somebody who that happened to, I'm happy to contact the U.S. Attorney or the Attorney General. Jason, I know well, and we've got an election task force. Let's get on that. Let's prosecute that to the full extent of the law. If those examples exist, they ought to be prosecuted. What the case has been, though, is that you hear these apocryphal stories. Sometimes they're repeated on the web, but even in states where you've seen dramatic rollback in voting rights and election task force put in place, I've seen virtually no examples of cases like that. Joe, if there are some, they ought to be prosecuted. I mean, I have seen down in Florida where the governor there, who's been trying to take on and restrict voting rights. I have seen examples where you've got this crew of policemen or law enforcement officers that have gone around and arrested people, mostly former felons. But even though I could understand if in Florida, there was a plebiscite and the voters overwhelmingly said that with appropriate restitution and others, folks who've committed a crime, and if they're back being good citizens, they ought to have their their rights to vote restored. I believe the only examples that I've seen where people were harassed by the Florida voting unit were actually cases where somebody didn't get appropriately notified, may have not gone through all the process, but it was seemed not with malicious intent. But boy, if you got a name or an example, you can share it with our team where somebody said they went to vote and somebody had voted before and it was they got valid ID of who they were. Let's prosecute that. That's against the law. Should be prosecuted. And,
okay.
And let's have at it.
Okay.
Senator, that was our final question.
All right. Well, in the spirit of Mark and Joe agreeing on let's prosecute real voter fraud, and me investing long on Danville, and with my fingers crossed today to make sure that the defense bill passes and my intelligence authorization bill is included in that package. I wish you a happy end of July, and look forward, as I said, coming to a sweaty market near you in August. It'll be interesting to see whether the August heat wave actually exceeds what's happened in July. But stay cool, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.